Welcome to this short introductory demonstration on procurement fraud, a two-part course from Tomjak e-learning. Over the next 10 minutes or so, I hope to explain to you what the course is all about and that you'll be sufficiently excited by it all to rush out and buy it at the end. Let's get stuck into it. The first thing to do is to outline the agenda for the course. As I say, it's in two parts. And in the first hour, what we're going to look at are the following topics. We're going to examine what fraud is exactly. We'll then move on to look at the characteristics and trends of frauds and at the actual fraudster, him or herself. We'll examine the fraud triangle. That's this whole concept of motive, opportunity and justification, before we get into some very detailed specifics around procurement fraud, particularly in the area of contract fraud. We'll take a break then and move into the second module, which will cover contract pricing, procurement fraud specifically in financial institutions, and then go on to talk about how you would combat fraud and how best to go about actually detecting whether or not a fraud has taken place. The course then concludes with a learning check. Having taken you through the agenda, what I'd like to do now is just pick a couple of topics to talk a little bit more about to give you an idea what the course is focused on. The first one we'll look at is the characteristics of fraud. But before we get into the details of contract fraud, let's just consider the characteristics of fraud generally. And I think it's fair to say that technology is an enabler in 24% of all the cases that are discovered. And when we talk about the amount of fraud that's discovered, of course, you have to imagine that it's a bit like the tip of an iceberg, and that the amount of fraud that goes undiscovered is probably 10 times larger than that which we've actually found. The most prevalent type of fraud, 47%, nearly half, is the misappropriation of assets. And mostly that's embezzlement, the theft of cash through businesses making payments that are illicit, but also around procurement fraud, which is what today's e-learning is all about. 66% of those frauds discovered occurred over periods ranging from 1 to 5 years. And I think that's important to remember. We'll come back to it. All right. A lot of fraudsters, once they found a way of doing something, will continue for quite a long period of time and get away with it before they're discovered. The fact is that having good internal control will prevent fraud occurring in your organization. And it's fair to say that weak internal controls are deemed to be a contributory factor in some 6% of the cases that have been discovered. And a final statistic which I think is worth bearing in mind is that perpetrators of fraud in 44% of the cases that were noted had unlimited authority. What exactly do we mean by unlimited authority? Well, I think what we mean by that is someone who either has the capacity to override a control, someone whose position allows them to sign off on things which lesser beings can't sign off on. In smaller companies, perhaps also the idea of just having single signatories making payments of one form or another can actually give people pretty much unlimited authority, because if there are weak controls as well, nobody is ever going to detect that a fraud has taken place. When it comes specifically to purchasing and procurement fraud, I think there are a few points which are worth bearing in mind. As I mentioned at the outset, contract fraud, which is one of the things we're going to be discussing, exists extensively both in the private and public sectors. I think what you tend to hear about on the news is much more around that which occurs in the public sector. But it is just as prevalent in the private sector, and that's what we're going to try and focus on. One of the other aspects is this whole concept of anti-competitive bid rigging. Most consider the idea of going out to tender or using a formal bid process as a way of ensuring that fraud does not take place. But as we will see, there are many ways around this that the fraudster exploits. Clearly, weak internal controls, a big contributory factor, generally and very much so in the purchasing and procurement areas. And if you've got good controls, trust me, things like this won't happen. It's worth remembering that fraud is not so much a two-way street, but can affect both purchasing and selling organizations. And I'll jump straight to the end, particularly if there's collusion with suppliers and vendors. So if you're just buying something, yes, you could be subject to some form of procurement fraud. But actually, if you're an organization which is involved in selling any of the things that we're talking about during the rest of this session, it could well be that members of your staff are working with people in other organizations to commit fraud on quite a wide scale. And when it comes to a wide scale, you've got to remember that fraud can occur both in large and small organizations, and in itself have big numbers attached to it or quite small ones. You may think it's not worth committing some form of small-scale fraud, but if you consider that the average time it takes to discover a fraud is somewhere around 5 or 6 years, if you're a relatively small person in a small organization not earning a big salary, but you can take out £10,000 a year over 6 years, that's £60,000, which is a lot of money. So frauds can be both big and small, and that's worth bearing in mind. The next topic I'd like to look at is that of the fraudster, him or herself. So let's take a little look at a profile of what the fraudster might look like. In overview, I think there are 3 or 4 things to consider. Firstly, the profile of the fraudster is actually changing over time. That's because more women are becoming involved, and I believe there are 2 or 3 reasons for that. The first is that there are more women in senior jobs now than there were before, and as we'll see later on, more senior people actually have the opportunity to override controls and so forth. I think there are genuinely more women in the workplace than there were before. And finally, quite frankly, women are seeing the opportunities for fraud, whereas perhaps they might have culturally or ethically pulled themselves back from it. They now see their male counterparts as equals, and so they're getting more involved. The second thing is that there are more young people involved, and I think this very much leads us to the third aspect, which is the increased use of electronic means of deception. I think younger people have a better understanding of the digital age in which we are, and not only understanding that age, but seeing the way around various controls that are put in place, which are perhaps in some cases somewhat archaic. So there are more young people getting involved in fraud, but probably in the main, that's around some sort of electronic means of deception, as opposed to out-and-out theft. So who commits the fraud? Are they men or are they women? Well, I've just said that more women are becoming involved, but in fact, for frauds that are discovered, only about 17% so far are generally committed by women. The majority, 79%, are committed by men. The balance, well, it's not actually disclosed in some cases who had actually committed the fraud. So whilst you're looking here at something that's running at about 1/5 versus 4/5 in terms of women versus men, I think whenever we talk about the fraudster, we need now to be considering both women and men in equal measure as we go forward. This course is all about procurement fraud, and one of the biggest areas of procurement fraud is that around contracts, or more specifically contract fraud. Over the next couple of slides, what I've included is a small extract from the course to give you a better taste, a better flavour of what we're really talking about. A contract is obviously a document which sets out how 2 parties will interact with each other in terms of the purchase, sale, construction, or otherwise. Contract fraud really focuses on how that contract is put together and the terms of delivery under that contract. As we shall see, there are countless possibilities and combinations which a fraudster can utilize to actually make things work to their advantage. When it comes down to that contract, I think the most important thing is to identify how the need for that product or service that you're contracting for has actually been identified. And you need to understand that it's very likely that a significant proportion of the contracts which your organization has undertaken, has signed off on, are probably not actually being fulfilled in the right way. And over the next few slides, we'll talk about not just the building of the contract itself, but the way in which people are delivering under the terms of that contract. So let's just talk for a minute about the identification of the need. I mean, clearly it's very obvious that someone can bribe an individual in the company to identify a perceived need, not a real need, for a particular product or a service. And they do that by offering them free gifts and hospitality. There's also this concept of when you're sitting and actually trying to sell a particular brand of product into a company, you would suggest that the product that you need for a particular task is unique. It's only available from one source. And by buying it from that source, you're paying clearly a premium price. That pricing may be available at significant discount elsewhere. But again, someone who has not actually looked at the way in which the contract is put together properly is circumventing those types of controls. Another thing that needs to be avoided when you look at a product or service is the length of the contract which you're actually getting involved in. An awful lot of contracts actually have penalty clauses in them, and whilst they will allow a change in the contract which upgrades the contract without penalty, that's to say that you pay an increased amount. If you need to come out of that contract, if you need to reduce the level of service, there are quite often penalties involved which can be quite significant. With that in mind, you really need to consider who was it that developed the detailed statement of need, the statement of works. At some point in a process, somebody needed to have sat down and said, we need this product. We need new PCs. We need a new data center. Somebody had to work out a very detailed list of what is needed. And I think it's very important to consider the qualifications of the person who did that, and whether or not the list that they developed, the potential needs that they identified and then found a product to satisfy, had actually been signed off at a reasonably senior level, depending on the amounts involved. And I also think it's very important to make sure that the details of what are needed are developed in a completely different way to perhaps the people who are identifying the potential suppliers who are going to meet that need. It's a question, quite honestly, putting the cart before the horse. If you've got a list of suppliers and you say, well, this is what they're going to give us, you need to make sure that the organization has very clearly identified what it is they need and then gone about searching for people and products who can meet that need. I think to conclude this slide, what I would say is that when you're looking at a contract, you're doing some work around that and evaluating the performance around that contract, you need to decide on what basis the decision to buy that product under that contract was actually made. And not only on what basis it was made, but by whom it was made. Is there sufficient documentation to adequately explain the process that has been through to identify the need, assess how that need can be best satisfied within the organization, see what products actually then can meet those needs, and then finally, and this is the last part, identified the suppliers of those needs. At that point, you may then have a comprehensive trail which tells you how someone arrived at a decision. A very important aspect when it comes down to looking for fraud within the area of contracts. Now clearly, what I've just told you is just a taster. There's a lot more to it, and you'll get access to that information when you buy the course. I hope what you've heard is of interest to you. So let me just give you a couple of quick details. The course runs for 120 minutes, that's 2 hours, and as I said before, it's in 2 modules. It costs £60 plus VAT, but clearly if you buy more than 10 of it for your organisation, then there are volume discounts available. It includes a knowledge check at the end and a completion certificate for CPD purposes. To buy the course, please email chrishollands@tomjak.co.uk or call me on 07901 931 387. I hope that was of interest to you, and if you'd like to buy one of the courses, well, I've given you all the details. But if you don't think it's suitable for you, but you think one of your colleagues might be interested, please feel free to pass the link on to them. Procurement fraud is pernicious and it needs to be stamped out. And it takes people such as yourself watching this to actually do that. And by utilizing this course, I hope that many people will get involved. Thank you very much.